Hi, this is Castle Bukowski for AP Gov Review, and in Unit 3, Part 3, 4, and 5, we'll be continuing our discussion on political parties, as well as take a closer look at third parties. Now, in terms of continuing our discussion on the organization of political parties, at the national level, really the big event is the National Convention, which takes place during the presidential year every 4 years, and it is really a place where you're going to formally nominate the candidate. Most of the time, the political party already knows who the person's going to be. But remember that in our last discussion, we said that people within the organization used to nominate the presidential candidate. So it would be a little bit more suspenseful. Today, it's more of a camaraderie way to build up the party and energize the party for the upcoming November election. So typically when you see those delegates coming, they're going to be more issue-oriented, they're going to be more ideological in terms of sort of having a firmer identity either as a conservative or a liberal than your average moderate or mainstream voter. Now you also have what's known as a national committee, which is one of the institutions that again is going to be helping the party operate between conventions, again can dictate and not necessarily dictate, but coordinate policy making at the local, state, and national levels. You also have the national chairperson who is responsible for day-to-day activities of the party, represents the party, gives the party a face, and really their biggest role is fundraising. The biggest problem for any political party is money. Even though Democrats and Republicans spend hundreds of millions of dollars every year on political campaigns, specifically presidential campaigns, money is always welcomed. So, the party in government promises and policies. So, of course, party members actually elected to the government, so they're not going to nominate anyone outside of the party because, again, you want to make sure that a candidate is loyal to you. And, of course, policy consequences are going to be made as a result of which party gets control of government, whether a bill is passed, whether a bill is not passed. And then you also have coalitions within political parties and sometimes between political parties if there's a common interest. And generally speaking, parties and politicians do tend to act on their campaign promises, although you're never going to come close to really 100%. Sometimes promises are extended a little bit too far, but they generally try to because they want to be in power in the next election. I'm briefly going to go through some of the party errors in American history. It is possible you might see one question in the AP Gov exam, but remember this is more a political theory exam more than an American history exam. So when we look at party eras, these are specific periods in which you see a majority of votes clinging towards the party. So you might see Democrats in power for several decades, whereas Republicans in another decade. When we look at critical elections, you're looking at an electoral earthquake where new issues and new coalitions emerge. A good example of that would be during the period in which FDR was elected during the Great Depression, where really you're going to have what's going to be called the party realignment, in which you're going to see the displacement of the majority party by the minority party, usually during critical election years. So typically it takes something very big and monstrous to happen to really shift new voters to another political party. So of course the first party system you had occurring with the Federalists being the first major political party, and then of course their rivals, the Democratic Republicans. And then you had a shift within the Democratic Republican parties as they're going to become just the Democrats, with Jackson being the founder of the modern party. And then you have the Whigs, of course, and then you will have the emergence of the Republicans during the Civil War with their anti-slavery platform. Jump ahead to 1932. During the Great Depression, you have the New Deal coalition, and this is forged by Democrats. You now have a solid block of Democrats consisting of urban workers, ethnic groups, specifically immigrants, Catholics, Jews, the poor, and Southerners. So this is a big shift, big coalition here. When we look at party coalitions today, when we look at groups within political parties, as we looked at in Unit 2 with political behavior, African Americans tend to support the Democratic Party along with Hispanics, Jews, and Catholics. Now we see certainly more of an edge toward Republicans with evangelicals, those with incomes over $100,000 being with Republicans again, lower income with Democrats, and so forth as you see here. It is of course important to note that females do support Democrats much more than males. So definitely know that, as we discussed in Unit 2 with political behavior. 1968 to the present, the era of divided government. Very important word to know here. When we talk about divided government, that's when one party controls Congress and the other controls the White House. So you have different parties in each branch, not different parties within the branches itself. Again, that's very important to know that you have different parties outside of the branches. So again, good example here, White House might be Democratic and the Congress might be Republican, which of course is going to create divided government. Now, sometimes you have divided government as a result of party de-alignment, which you have people really backing away from political parties, and as a result, they are not identifying with the political party anymore. And you have ticket splitting, as we talked about in the previous video. You also have party neutrality, where people are just simply indifferent towards the two parties. They don't necessarily like them. But if you look at divisions within parties, I mean, still, when you look at, for example, on a vote of extension of the unemployment benefits, Republicans voting overwhelmingly no and Democrats voting overwhelmingly yes, you notice that you still have 39 Republicans who voted yes. In this case, maybe not the best example, Democrats are voting no, but you see that it's typically not completely unanimous. Certainly you do have a majority, but not unanimous. So you do see divisions even within the party itself. And, while you do have platforms for Republicans and Democrats, again, this doesn't necessarily mean that that particular candidate is going to support that 100%. When we also look at divided government, if you look at a map here of the United States, of state government, you notice that you do not see complete Democratic or complete Republican control. In many states, you see purple, which has divided party control, where again, you might have a Democratic governor and a Republican legislature. Of course, with Nebraska being a unicameral state legislature, that is the exception here on the map. But you have a lot of divided government throughout the United States. Let's move on with part 4 in terms of talking about the two-party system here. Really, the most important consequence of this is the moderation of views, because you only have two parties, so they're not going to go too extreme. They want to get that middle vote. So this, of course, is going to discourage extreme views. It's going to even create some ambiguity. It's going to be unclear as to where certain candidates, stand on specific issues, because again, the Democratic Party espouses so many views. You don't have a third party that's somewhere in the middle or, espouses more extreme views, because again, to get represented in government, you need to have people vote for you. Now, if you see any question about the two-party system, why it exists, it's because the United States has a plurality system, where the winner who gets the most votes, not a majority, the most votes will win. So you see this with the Electoral College. If you get just the most votes, even if you only have 37% of the votes and 3 other people who are running get lower than 37%, you technically don't have a majority, because a majority is 51%. So you don't even need a majority, but you get all of those votes. And people have criticized that as being really unfair and not proportional, unlike many European countries as well as Canada. But nevertheless, most voters are satisfied that their individual beliefs fall into one of these two coalitions that the parties represent, again, being a Democrat or a Republican, or specifically liberals and conservatives. Third parties, you rarely see them winning elections. Very, very rare that actually happens. Probably the closest it's ever happened, and you can correct me if you can find this, would probably be Teddy Roosevelt's Bull Moose Party came the closest to winning. But really since then, you haven't really had a major contender, even with Ralph Nader and the Green Party, really not too much. But there are 4 types of third parties. First one being ideological, so you're looking more, for example, when we talk about Libertarian Party, limited government, that is an ideology that one follows. You also have what are known as one issue or single issues. So you're looking at just one particular narrow cause. So a good example would be the Prohibition Party seeking to make alcohol illegal. They're not really taking a stance on taxes. They're not taking a stance on abortion. It's strictly about alcohol. You also have economic protests, which tend to be more regionalized. You don't really see those too much. And then, of course, you have factional parties, which have actually the greatest chance of an impact, because they're a party typically sometimes within a party themselves. So within the Republican Party, you if you recall something known as the Tea Party, which still has remnants existing, they were focusing on being taxed enough already, hence the TEA in the name. And again, the major parties will probably do whatever they can to make sure that there's not a split in the party. Anytime you have a split in your party, that's going to really wreak havoc for the major political party. But, while third parties are important, there is no doubt. I mean, they, for example, are safety valves for popular discontent. When people don't feel like the two parties are representing their needs, they will go to third parties. They also bring new ideas and groups into politics, but the problem is this great example of a B. The new issue that the third parties will take up will sting the major political parties. They might lose a few votes, they might lose a few state elections, but the third parties don't last that long because the major parties say, hey, that was a great idea. This is a great innovation. We're going to adopt your idea. And as a result, the third party is going to die out of existence. So the new issue will sting the major political parties, but will then die once the party adopts the new issue. And that's very, very true. So again, many different types here of political parties, as we've talked about, in terms of minority parties. And here's a less happy or optimistic view of the two major political parties. You might even espouse that yourself. But nevertheless, when we look at countries, aside from the United States, really don't see a plurality. You see more proportional representation in which seats within the legislature are awarded based on the votes received. So you might have 10 parties running, and if each of the parties got 10% of the vote, well, then they're all going to be awarded 10% of the legislative seats. Again, proportional. You also have coalition governments where two or more parties join to form a majority in a national legislature. So it's very similar in that regard there too. Now, some of the barriers towards minor parties or third political parties, electoral college. Remember, we just talked about you need to have a plurality. So the winner-takes-all system does not work in their favor. Also, ballot access laws are very difficult, and sometimes you need 10% in polling to get your name on the ballot. It can also cost several $1,000s. You also have people's attitudes, which are an issue. For example, wasted vote syndrome. People sometimes think a third party vote is a waste because typically third parties don't win elections. So as a result, you might feel like you're wasting your vote and you'll vote for one of the two major parties. Also, it might be, the history of it. Your great-grandfather was always a Republican or a Democrat, and you just sort of follow what your family has. So again, these are some of the major barriers as to why you don't see this working so well with political parties. But when we look at minor parties in the United States, you see that they don't really come that close. As I said earlier, the Bull Moose Party with Theodore Roosevelt getting 27% of the popular votes and the most electoral votes ever received. Again, very difficult in those times and probably more difficult with the amount of money it costs in today's times. Okay, let's go into part 5 real quickly. So it's party over. While political parties are no longer the biggest source of information the media are, they still play major roles as we've identified, and they help coordinate parties, and at the end of the day, the majority of people still do identify with a political party, so keep that in mind as well. Party does have big influence, especially amongst its party members within government to vote a particular way. But again, we see that oftentimes, especially if it's a particular issue, you will see that the candidate might at times vote against the party. But overall, they are going to vote within the party, the way the party is going. Now, when we look at constituency versus ideology, the prime determinant of a politician's vote is most likely to be coming down to ideology. On some issues that are not the most important, they may ignore the constituency's opinion, but certainly on controversial issues, it's definitely important for the politician to heed to the constituent's opinion, especially if you are running for election. And then again, while there are the bonds of party, you have seen some slippage in party support. Even in the past, presidents could offer their other candidates support, and they would ride the presidential coattails. You don't see that much anymore, as they are not really won this way. All right, let's finish up with a review question. Hit the pause button should you need to. All right, and if you said choice B right here, you are correct.